A dog saved 7 soldiers, but his fate was never told, until one of them returned years later, with a secret in his hands. Chapter 1. A Shadow in the Rubble. The air in the Belgian village of Meyerode tasted of frost and cordite. A biting December wind whipped through the skeletal remains of what were once homes, carrying with it a fine, persistent snow that clung to every surface like a shroud. Corporal Jack Riley pulled the collar of his M1943 field jacket tighter around his neck, the coarse wool scratching his skin. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that gnawed at his bones, a constant reminder of how far he was from the warm, predictable autumns of Ohio. His squad, the 7 of them who were left of the original 12, moved through the rubble with the practiced silence of men who had learned that noise was a luxury they couldn't afford. Sergeant Miller was in the lead, his M1 Garand held low, his face a grim mask carved from stone and fatigue. Behind him, Russo, a fast-talking kid from Brooklyn, shivered dramatically, his breath pluming in white clouds. "I swear, Sarge," he whispered, his voice raspy, "my kids are going to be born as ice cubes." Miller didn't turn. "Quiet, Russo. Keep your eyes peeled." They were clearing the village, a methodical and soul-crushing task. The Germans had been pushed out less than 12 hours ago, leaving behind a ghost town of shattered brick and splintered timber. It was in the remains of a small bakery, its oven a gaping blackened maw, that Jack saw it, a flicker of movement in the deepest shadows. He froze, raising his rifle, his heart thudding against his ribs. The others stopped instantly, melting into the ruins around them. "Riley, what is it?" Miller's voice was a low growl. "Movement, Sarge. Back corner." For a long minute, the only sound was the mournful sigh of the wind. Then a low whimper, a sound so full of misery it cut through the cold. Jack lowered his rifle slightly, exchanging a confused look with Peterson, the youngest in their squad, whose face was pale with fear. Slowly Jack moved forward, his boots crunching on fallen plaster. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice gentle. "It's all right." From the darkness, a pair of intelligent amber eyes watched him. As he got closer, a shape resolved itself from the gloom. A dog. It was a German shepherd mix, but emaciated, its ribs a stark washboard beneath a coat of matted, mud-caked fur. One of its ears was torn, and it held a front paw off the ground, trembling uncontrollably from cold, fear, or both. It didn't bark or growl, it just watched him, its body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt. Jack stopped a few feet away and crouched, setting his rifle aside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last piece of a D-ration bar he'd been saving. He broke off a small piece and tossed it onto the dusty floor. The dog flinched, but didn't move. Its gaze flickered from Jack to the chocolate and back again. "It's for you," Jack said softly, remembering his own dog, a golden retriever named Buddy, waiting for him back on the farm. The thought was a painful ache in his chest. The dog took a hesitant step forward, then another, its nose twitching. It snatched the piece of chocolate and retreated into the shadows to devour it. "For Christ's sake, Riley, we don't have time for this," Miller grumbled, striding over. He looked down at the pathetic creature and scowled. "It's a stray. Probably belongs to the Krauts. Leave it." "He's starving, Sarge," Jack pleaded, keeping his voice low. "Look at him. He's no threat." As if on cue, the dog finished the chocolate and let out another heart-wrenching whimper. Russo appeared at Jack's shoulder. "Poor bastard," he muttered. "Looks how I feel." Miller sighed, running a hand over his weary face. "We can't take a dog with us. It's regulations. It's a liability. What are you going to do when it starts barking in the middle of a patrol?" "He won't," Jack said, with a certainty he didn't feel. "He's smart. I can feel it." He tossed another piece of the ration bar, this time a little closer. The dog crept forward again, its movements slow and pained. When it finished, it didn't retreat. It just stood there looking at Jack, its tail giving a single, hopeful thump against the floor. That was what did it. That tiny sign of trust in a world built on violence. Miller watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Jack was sure he would order him to leave the dog, or worse. Instead, the sergeant just shook his head. "Fine," he conceded, his voice gruff. "But it's your responsibility, Riley. It makes one wrong move. It's on you, and it needs a name. Can't just call it Dog?" Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. He looked at the dog, who was now cautiously sniffing his outstretched hand. Its fur was the color of dirty smoke rising from a chimney. "Smokey," Jack said, a small smile touching his lips for the first time in weeks. "His name is Smokey." Chapter 2. The Whispering Woods. The world shrank to the confines of the Ardennes forest. Towering pines, heavy with snow, formed a dense canopy that swallowed the light, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The air was still and frigid, the silence so profound that the crunch of their boots in the deep snow sounded like gunshots. It had been 2 days since the German panzers had smashed through the American lines, 2 days since the world had devolved into chaos, 2 days of being hunted. Smokey, who had been a creature of skin and bones in the ruined bakery, was already looking better. Scraps of food from 7 soldiers, however meager, were more than he'd had in weeks. He trotted alongside Jack, no longer limping, his gait silent and sure-footed. He never strayed more than a few feet, his amber eyes constantly scanning the oppressive woods, his ears twitching at sounds the men couldn't hear. He had become more than a mascot. He was a silent sentinel. Earlier that morning, as they navigated a narrow game trail, Smokey had suddenly stopped, a low, barely audible rumble vibrating in his chest. He'd frozen, staring intently at a drift of snow near the base of a large oak. "What's he got?" Russo whispered, his hand tightening on his weapon. Jack placed a calming hand on Smokey's back. "Easy, boy." Miller motioned for them to halt. He crept forward, using the butt of his rifle to carefully probe the snow. There was a dull, metallic clink. He brushed away the snow to reveal the 3 menacing prongs of a German S-mine, a bouncing Betty. Had someone stepped on it, the canister would have launched into the air and detonated at waist height, spraying shrapnel in every direction. It would have taken out at least 3 of them. They all stood in stunned silence, looking from the mine to the dog. "Well, I'll be damned," Miller breathed, his usual gruffness replaced by a grudging respect. "The mutt just saved your legs, Russo." From that moment on, Smokey's place in the squad was cemented. He wasn't a liability, he was their edge. He was their eyes and ears in a place where a single mistake meant a frozen death or a German prison camp. Jack felt a fierce surge of pride. He shared his water with the dog, rubbing the rime of ice from Smokey's whiskers with his woolen glove. "You're a good boy," he'd murmur when no one else was listening. "The best boy." Their objective was to head west, to try and reconnect with what was left of the 28th Infantry Division near Bastogne. But the maps were useless. The snow had transformed the landscape into a featureless white hell, and the constant fear of stumbling into an enemy patrol forced them on a circuitous, exhausting route. That afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, ugly grey, and the snow began to fall in thick, wet flakes. It muffled the world even further, reducing visibility to less than 20 yards. They were moving through a small valley when Smokey stopped again. This time he didn't growl. He flattened himself to the ground, whining softly, his nose pointed up the ridge to their right. Jack immediately dropped to a knee, pulling Smokey close. "Sarge!" he hissed. The squad froze, their weapons at the ready, their eyes straining to pierce the curtain of falling snow. For a long moment, there was nothing. Peterson started to tremble, his knuckles white on his rifle stock. "I don't see anything," Miller whispered, his binoculars pressed to his eyes. "Smokey smells them," Jack insisted. "He's sure of it." And then they heard it. A faint clink of metal, a muffled cough, and then a voice speaking in harsh guttural German. They were closer than anyone could have imagined. An enemy patrol, using the storm for cover, just like them. Had they continued for another 30 seconds, they would have walked right into them. Miller signaled frantically, pointing back the way they came. They retreated, moving like ghosts, their hearts hammering in their chests. They didn't stop until they were a mile away, huddled in a thicket of firs so dense it offered some protection from the wind and snow. The adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by the gnawing cold and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. They were alive, but they were still hopelessly lost. As darkness fell, enveloping the forest completely, Jack sat with his back against a tree, Smokey curled tightly against his side for warmth. The dog's steady breathing was a small, comforting rhythm in the vast, hostile wilderness. Jack buried his face in Smokey's thick fur, the scent of wet dog and pine a strangely grounding anchor in the chaos. They were still alive, and it was all because of the stray he'd found in the rubble. Chapter 3. Hunger and a Fading Hope. The third day blurred into the fourth, and hope began to feel like another ration they were running out of. The gnawing emptiness in their bellies had become a constant, dull ache, a cold counterpoint to the relentless chill that seeped through their uniforms. They were down to their last K-rations, splitting a single tin of processed cheese and a handful of crackers between the 7 of them. The meager meal did little to silence the symphony of their protesting stomachs. Morale, once buoyed by the adrenaline of their escape, was now as brittle as the frozen twigs under their boots. The men grew quiet, their faces drawn and sallow in the weak winter light. Rousseau's jokes had dried up, replaced by a sullen silence. Peterson, the kid, looked hollow-eyed, his youthful optimism completely eroded, leaving only a quiet, constant fear. Sergeant Miller pushed them onward with a grim determination, but even his iron will was showing signs of rust. "Keep moving," he'd rasp, his voice hoarse. "Stop, and you freeze. It's that simple." Smokey seemed to sense the shift in mood. He stuck even closer to Jack, often pressing against his leg as they marched, a warm, living presence in the deadening cold. But the dog was suffering too. His energy was flagging, and Jack could once again see the faint outline of his ribs. He'd offered Smokey the last of his own cracker, which the dog had licked gratefully from his palm. The gesture didn't go unnoticed. "You can't be giving your food to that thing, Riley," grumbled Henderson, a burly corporal who rarely spoke. "We need every crumb we've got." "He's one of us," Jack retorted, his voice sharp with a protectiveness that surprised even himself. "He's earned his keep more than any of us." "He's a dog," Henderson shot back. "When it comes down to it, it's us or him." A tense silence fell over the small group. Before it could escalate, Miller stepped in. "Enough, Riley's right. The dog stays and he eats what we eat. We're not savages yet." His words settled the matter, but the underlying tension remained. They were a pack, and like any pack weakened by hunger, they were starting to turn on each other. It was late afternoon when Smokey provided another miracle. They had been marching for hours, their thirst becoming as agonizing as their hunger. Every stream they'd found had been frozen solid. As they staggered through a grove of skeletal birch trees, Smokey suddenly veered off the path. He began digging frantically at the base of a snow-covered bank, whining with an excited urgency. "What's he doing now?" Rousseau muttered, leaning heavily on his rifle. Jack knelt beside the dog, his frozen fingers fumbling as he helped clear the snow. Beneath a foot of powder, he felt it. Soft, damp earth. And then, a trickle of water flowing from a small spring insulated by the deep snowdrift. It wasn't frozen. A collective sigh of relief went through the men. They fell to their knees, filling their canteens and drinking the icy, clean water until their stomachs ached. Jack splashed some on his face, the shock of the cold making him feel alive again. He cupped his hands, letting Smokey lap greedily. The dog looked up at him, his tail giving a few strong, happy thumps. An hour later, as twilight began to bleed through the trees, Smokey's ears perked up. He froze, his body low to the ground, his gaze fixed on a thicket of holly bushes about 50 yards away. This was different from his previous warnings. There was no low growl, no sign of fear. It was the focused stillness of a hunter. Jack watched him holding his breath. Suddenly Smokey exploded into motion. He burst from the trees, a brown and black streak against the white snow, and dove headfirst into the thicket. There was a frantic rustling, a high-pitched squeal, and then Smokey emerged, a large snowshoe hare dangling from his mouth. He trotted back to Jack and proudly dropped his prize at his feet. For a moment everyone just stared. 7 starving soldiers, saved first by a spring and now by a hunt, all thanks to the stray from Mayorode. Rousseau was the first to break the silence. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Well, I'll be a son of a gun," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Smokey, you magnificent mutt." That night, for the first time in days, they had a real meal. They built a small, smokeless fire in a deep ravine, the rabbit roasting on a spit. The smell of cooking meat was intoxicating, a forgotten luxury. As they ate, sharing the small portions in near-reverent silence, the tension that had plagued them finally broke. They were more than just a squad again. They were survivors, bound by the shared experience of cold, fear, and now this small, miraculous feast. Jack tore off a piece of the tender meat and gave it to Smokey, who devoured it in seconds. The dog settled down, resting his head on Jack's lap, letting out a contented sigh. In the faint, flickering light of the fire, surrounded by the immense, threatening darkness of the forest, Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude. Smokey wasn't just a dog, he was their hope. Chapter 4. The Crossroads of Fire. The rabbit and the water had renewed them, body and soul. With food in their bellies and their canteens full, the world seemed less hostile. By Miller's best guess, they were getting close to the Allied lines. The distant, muffled thunder of artillery seemed more consistent now, a deadly pulse that guided them westward. Their goal was a small town called Noville, just north of Bastogne, which intelligence said was a key junction. If they could reach it, they could find friendly forces. On the fifth day, the terrain began to change. The dense forest thinned, giving way to rolling hills and snow-covered fields, broken up by small farmsteads and the dark, skeletal lines of fences. It was more open, more exposed, more dangerous. They crested a low ridge in the late afternoon and saw it below them, a crossroads, a proper stone-paved road, a sight so civilized it was almost jarring. One road led west, directly towards the sound of the fighting. This was their path. "All right, easy now," Miller whispered, holding up a hand. The squad dropped to their bellies in the deep snow, their breath misting in the frigid air. "That road's a perfect kill zone. We don't cross until we're damn sure it's clear." They lay there for nearly an hour, scanning the opposite tree line with binoculars. Nothing. No movement, no smoke, no tracks other than those of deer. The world was blanketed in a heavy, unnatural silence. "Looks clear, Sarge," Peterson whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. "Maybe we should just go for it." "Patience, kid," Miller grunted, not lowering his binoculars. "Something doesn't feel right." It was then that Smokey, lying flat beside Jack, began to change. A low, menacing growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound Jack had never heard before. The fur along his spine stood on end. His lips curled back from his teeth, and his eyes were fixed on a small, unassuming cluster of snow-dusted pine trees directly across the road. "Sarge, it's Smokey," Jack said urgently, his own stomach twisting into a knot of fear. "He's got something, and he doesn't like it." Miller lowered his binoculars and looked at the dog. He'd learned to trust Smokey's instincts implicitly. "Where, boy?" he murmured. Smokey's growl intensified, his whole body trembling with a mixture of aggression and warning. He was staring at the pine trees, about 100 yards away. To the men, it looked like nothing, just a clump of trees. But Smokey saw, or smelled, the truth. And then he did something that defied all logic, all training, all sense of self-preservation. Before Jack could grab his collar, before anyone could react, Smokey broke cover. He launched himself down the hill, a silent, furry missile streaking across the pristine snow of the open field. He wasn't running from danger. He was running directly towards it. "Smokey, no, get back here," Jack screamed, his voice raw with panic. The dog ignored him. He was a dozen yards from the road when the world exploded. The distinct, terrifying rip of an MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw, tore the air apart. A storm of tracer rounds erupted from the cluster of pines, chewing up the snow exactly where the squad would have been if they'd started to cross. The sound was deafening, a physical force that hit them in the chest, a German machine gun nest, perfectly concealed, lying in wait. Smokey had saved them from walking straight into an ambush, but in doing so, he had exposed himself. The machine gun swiveled, trying to track the charging dog. Muzzle flashes winked from other positions in the tree line. Riflemen. The ambush had been sprung. "Return fire!" Miller roared, his voice barely audible over the din. The 7 men opened up, their Garands cracking sharply, laying down suppressing fire on the enemy positions. The firefight was sudden, brutal and chaotic. Snow kicked up by bullets flew everywhere, obscuring their vision. Jack's world narrowed to a single, horrifying point of focus. He saw Smokey, still running, jink to the left as a burst of machine gun fire tore up the ground where he'd been a second before. The dog wasn't retreating. He was still charging the nest, a wild, selfless act of diversion. He was drawing their fire, giving his men the precious seconds they needed to react. Jack saw him leap over a fallen log near the edge of the road. Then a German stick grenade arced through the air and landed in the snow just beyond him. The world turned white and red. A concussive whump lifted Smokey off his feet and threw him sideways, out of sight behind a snowdrift. "No!" Jack screamed, a primal sound of pure anguish. "Riley, stay down!" Miller yelled, grabbing his jacket and pulling him flat as another burst of fire zipped over their heads. "We gotta move, push through now!" They had an opening. The Germans, distracted by the dog and now taking effective fire, were momentarily suppressed. It was their only chance. "Go! Go! Go!" Fueled by a mix of terror and rage, they surged forward, firing as they ran, a desperate, stumbling charge across the road and into the trees on the other side. They crashed through the German line, a whirlwind of close-quarters combat. Jack fired his rifle until it was empty, his mind numb, his actions purely instinctual. Moments later, it was over. They were through. They scrambled deeper into the woods, leaving the sound of shouting German voices behind them. They didn't stop running for half a mile. When they finally collapsed into a heap of gasping, shaking exhaustion, the reality crashed down on Jack. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild. "We have to go back," he choked out, turning back towards the crossroads. "We have to get him." Miller caught his arm, his grip like iron. His own face was streaked with grime and sweat, his eyes filled with a grim sorrow. "We can't, Riley. It's over. He's gone." "No, he might be hurt. We can't just leave him." Jack struggled against the sergeant's grip, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Listen to me," Miller said, his voice hard but not unkind. "That dog just saved all our lives. You know that. I know that. But if we go back there, we'll lose ours too, and his sacrifice will be for nothing. We have to keep moving. That's the order." Jack finally stopped fighting, a terrible, hollow emptiness opening up inside him. He looked back at the snow-covered woods, praying for a sign, for the familiar shape of his friend to come trotting out of the trees, but there was nothing. Only the falling snow, the darkening sky, and the profound, soul-crushing silence where a hero had been lost. Chapter 5. A debt unspoken. They stumbled into the American lines an hour after dawn, looking more like ghosts than soldiers. Their uniforms were torn and filthy, their faces gaunt and smeared with the grime of battle, their eyes holding the haunted, thousand-yard stare of men who had been pushed past their limits and somehow returned. The outpost, a hastily dug-in position manned by a company of paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, was a chaotic but welcome sight of order amidst the madness. The 7 of them were quickly surrounded, given steaming mugs of coffee that scalded their throats, and led to a makeshift command post in a half-destroyed farmhouse. Sergeant Miller made his report to a weary-looking captain, his voice a flat monotone as he recounted their story, cut off during the initial German push, evading patrols, and finally breaking through a weak point in the enemy line. He listed the 7 names of the survivors. There was no official space in the report for a dog. Later, huddled around a pot-bellied stove in a blissfully warm barn, the reality of their survival began to sink in. The feeling wasn't elation or victory, it was a heavy, hollow ache. They had made it, but the 8th member of their patrol had not. The silence between them was thick with unspoken thoughts of Smokey. It was Rousseau who finally broke it, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "He knew, you know," he said, staring into the flames. "That machine gun nest. He knew it was there before we did. He ran right at them." Henderson, the big corporal who had once called Smokey a liability, looked down at his hands. "He didn't just run at them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He drew their fire, gave us the opening. I saw it, they were all shooting at him." He looked up, his gaze finding Jack's across the cramped space. "He saved us, Riley. Your dog saved every last one of us." Jack could only nod, a lump in his throat so tight he couldn't speak. He felt a profound, crushing weight of guilt. He was the one who had brought Smokey into their world of violence and death. He had made a silent promise to the trusting animal in that ruined bakery, a promise he had failed to keep. The warmth of the stove couldn't touch the chill that had settled deep inside his soul. He kept seeing it over and over in his mind, the arc of the grenade, the flash of the explosion, the small, furry body thrown into the air. The war, indifferent to their personal grief, moved on. The Battle of the Bulge raged for another month before the Germans were finally pushed back. The 7 men of the squad were eventually separated, reassigned to fill the gaps in other depleted units. They shook hands, promised to write, to look each other up after the war, the kind of promises soldiers make knowing they will likely be broken by time and distance. But before they parted, they made another vow, a silent one. They would never forget. Jack Riley survived the war. He returned home to the green rolling hills of Ohio in the summer of 1945, a decorated corporal with a quietness about him that hadn't been there before. He took over the family farm, married his sweetheart, and raised 2 children. He lived a good life, a full life, the life Smokey had bought for him and 6 other men at a frozen crossroads in Belgium, but the debt was never repaid. The question of Smokey's fate became a quiet ghost that walked beside him for the rest of his days. In the official annals of World War II, there is no mention of a stray German shepherd mix who saved an American squad. No medal was ever struck, no citation written. His heroism existed only in the memories of the men who owed him everything. Decades later, Jack, now an old man with hands weathered by a lifetime of work and a face mapped with the lines of his long years, would sit on his porch in the evenings. His golden retriever, a gentle soul named Buddy the Sem, would rest his head on his knee. Jack would stroke the dog's soft fur, and his gaze would drift to the horizon, but his mind would be half a world and a lifetime away, in the snow-choked darkness of the Ardennes forest. He would remember the feel of a shivering body pressed against his for warmth, the intelligence in a pair of amber eyes, and the impossible courage of a creature who gave everything for the men he had adopted as his pack. He never knew if the end was quick, or if Smokey had suffered, or if by some impossible miracle he had crawled away and survived. That uncertainty was the heaviest burden of all. The official story was that 7 American soldiers were cut off and heroically fought their way back to Allied lines. But Jack Riley knew the truth. He knew their survival wasn't a story of their own heroism alone. It was the story of a dog who saved them all, whose ultimate fate was never told, but whose sacrifice was etched forever into the heart of a grateful soldier.